All right. Well, I'm Brendo, and this is Ben. And this is the High Road Podcast.
Welcome. It's gonna be a good one.
Should be a good one.
Definitely gonna be.
Hopefully.
Definitely gonna be a good one.
Probably. Ben's more confident than I am, I
Cheers.
think.
Cheers.
So, today we're going to talk a little bit about breaking addictions, which I think is an important topic for almost everyone, especially Americans. Everyone's got some kind of an addiction, whether that's tobacco or alcohol or fast food or gambling or sex or pornography. For some people, it could just be, emotional eating. It could be, addiction to people or to emotions.
I was gonna say you can be addicted to emotions.
You can be addicted to negative emotions, to drama. Everyone's got different...
addicted to the same thoughts.
Addicted to the same thoughts. Yeah, that give some sort of sense of meaning or satisfaction. I know for me personally, I've been working with some addictions that I have recently. Like, for example, nicotine. I just recently quit nicotine. For a long time, I was a tobacco user. I put tobacco into spliffs with some cannabis. And then I became a cigarette smoker. And then I became somebody that vaped. And then I became someone that took nicotine tablets for a long time. And I recently decided I just didn't want any kind of a nicotine habit. And I quit that nicotine habit. And that was extremely hard. What about you, Ben? Have you been working with any addictions recently that you've been kind of working on weaning out of your life?
Yeah, definitely haven't mastered it, but the one that's been ongoing for me is just like mindless social media, just of any capacity, mostly Instagram. Just like looking at it close after waking up, or just if I have a little bit of free time, and instead of being really intentional with what I'm going to do with that 2 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever, I'm just let whatever, my feed, whatever comes up to dictate how I'm spending that time, and it's just, it never ends productively. So for me, it's like small things like that are, cutting out the flow of my life the way that I want it to be lived, at least currently. And I'm sure most of us probably have some form of that with technology, social media. There's just so much out there. I want to add to this episode as well, like, let's look at what is addiction in the first place, and then to me also, like, what's the difference between addiction and habits, and is addiction a habit, and how can we upgrade addictions into positive habits and things of that nature, because we're all habitual beings, and first we make our habits and then our habits make us. So I want to dive more into that concept and see what goal we can get from it.
You're bringing up a really important subject that I didn't even touch on, which is the social media, the doom scrolling, right?
Yeah.
The dopamine doom scrolling, and we're all guilty of it. And, during COVID, I took 18 months off of all social media. When COVID happened and everybody went full steam on social media 24 hours a day because everyone was in lockdown and at home. Of course, this is only true for some people. Here in Florida, that was a very limited period of time. But most people in the country were locked down, and everybody got on social media, and I got off social media. And that changed my brain's chemistry in a very powerful way. And I stopped having a addictive compulsion to using social media. And to be honest, almost nothing has been better for my mental health. It's given me so much peace of mind to not have this compulsion to constantly be checking my phone and constantly checking to see if something new has happened. But what ends up happening is that constant checking cuts into your life, and you start to not spend your time on creating things, but consuming things. And you get in the habit of consuming things instead of creating them. And it's kind of a lazy position to be in.
Yeah.
And also, it also really restored my critical thinking, my own independent critical thinking, and my ability to form my own opinions based on that critical thinking, instead of just sort of getting what the crowd is telling me. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I know that's going to be very important for a lot of people watching this.
Yeah.
Because it's something that now I'm back on social media now. I now use it occasionally. I tend to use Twitter the most. I use X the most. And I find myself like, scrolling sometimes for an hour at a time, just kind of filling space. It really, it's become the television of the new generations.
Yeah.
Our parents' generations, so that would be the Gen Zers and the boomers. For them, it was about TV. They'd come home, they'd plop down on the couch, they'd put in 3-4 hours of television watching. But our generation does that with social media. We get off of work, we get at home, we open up our Instagram or Facebook, and we scroll.
Yep.
And it's the same kind of mindless, just filling the space because we don't want to feel what's happening around us. We want an escape from what's going on with us. And people don't generally think of it as an addiction, but it really is.
Yeah. If we were to go back 50 years and be in that world or have someone from that world, and then they were able to peek into the modern world, it would look absolutely ridiculous the way we live our lives. Like, we have these little, square thingies, and they go with us wherever we go. And if you don't have it for more than 30 minutes, you feel like some part of your life is incomplete. And you're like, if it's missing, you think like your whole life is over. And yeah, we literally like keep it on us at all times, like it really is needed. But at the end of the day, it's mostly not. Like, these were originally built just to be able to communicate from one point to another point. That was it. Like, it was just to be able to call someone if you're far away and relay information. Obviously, there's so much beneficial stuff from it, but we're so reliant on it, so dependent, and like we really have gotten to the point where we think we need it all the time. We really don't, and it's cutting into so much things that are important in our lives, and we don't even know we're missing because we're so used to it.
It's about it's about how you leverage it, right?
Yeah.
It's not so much about using it or not using it. It's how are you using it, right?
Yeah.
Like, I can use an axe to cut wood, and I can also use an axe to kill an animal. It's a tool. It's how you use that tool, and that's really what you're trying to accomplish. And I think it's how you leverage it, right? Like, if you're creating content and you're using it to create content and put out a signal, then I think that's a better use of social media in general than consuming content. But there's a balance there, right? Like, we all kind of like to do both. Well, at least we all like to consume. We don't necessarily all like to create content. I think a lot of people like to create content, but don't necessarily feel like they have the courage or the time or the commitment to actually do that. But for me, it's about putting out a message, putting out a signal, and trying to do that more often than consuming what's out there and just funneling that into my reality.
100%. Yeah, I mean, obviously we're using it right now, and it's very important. I'm just trying to make the distinction of like, it just definitely is an addiction overall, and that we're all so immersed in it that we fail to see that it even is an addiction in the first place. So
yeah, maybe it's a good moment to talk about what designates an addiction. How do we designate something? How do we assign something as an addiction versus just something that we're using?
Can we get the definition of addiction?
So give us the textbook definition. But I mean, for me personally, my own definition is it's something that I'm doing with compulsion rather than choice.
Yeah.
You're doing it on autopilot. It isn't a choice that you're making through your own agency and autonomy.
We can't read it.
You gotta read it.
You have to read it.
You're gonna have to read it.
We can't read it.
What do you mean?
We can't see it.
We need you to read it.
Just read it. Just read it.
Just jabber it off. Just jabber it off.
We can't see the words.
It's good.
It's huge.
It's good. No.
Just read it, bro.
We just want your voice. We just want your voice, to be honest.
Bro, read it, bro.
We just want your voice. All right, so I was a little shy today. Addiction is defined as a chronic relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite adverse consequences. It is considered a brain disorder because it involves functional changes to brain circuits involved in reward, stress, and self-control. I think that's drug addiction. That's specifically to drug addiction. not addiction.
But it
in
makes some
general.
good general.
But yeah,
points, too.
makes some good points on it.
And our brain is making chemicals which are almost like drugs, so it's like, you know, it could.
Yeah,
But yeah, it's not the.
Well, in fact, that is what's happening. Your brain is actually producing drugs in vivo, right, in your own body. So you get high on your own drugs all day, every day. Dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, right? These different neurotransmitters that are produced because of our different habits and brain states and exercise, our sleep, things like that. So, you know, I saw a really great special on Huberman, Dr. Huberman recently, where he goes into the nitty-gritty of talking about dopamine cycles and how most people are dopamine fixing, right? You could think of dopamine fixing as like, I mean, really, addiction and dopamine fixing are kind of the same thing. They kind of go hand in hand. You know, it's this feeling of almost discomfort that we get when we're in the presence of our own feelings and thoughts. And we want to kind of escape that with sort of a pick-me-up, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have that Coca-Cola, or we have that, you know, pizza, or we watch TV, or we drink caffeine. You know, caffeine is one that I'm it's an addiction that I'm comfortable with, but I definitely have right now.
Yeah.
I've been doing caffeine for at least 20 years, since college. You know, it's got things that are good and things that are bad, but I lean into that for like kind of a morning pick-me-up, and I do notice that I'm not quite as like bright and alert and with it or talkative or energetic when I don't have that there. So I do think that it is an addiction, and a lot of times we don't think of a lot of things that are widely available as addictions.
Yeah,
right?
because they're just they're normalized.
Because they're just so normalized in society. Like take for example alcohol, right? Like alcohol is hugely normalized in our society, but there are many people who are very, very, very addicted to it, but nobody will call it an addiction because it's so widely available to everybody, right?
Yeah.
It's considered just, or nicotine. You can find nicotine and alcohol in every corner store in the entire country.
Yeah.
And globally.
Yeah.
So everyone says, well, that can't be an addiction because, I mean, certainly the argument can be made that
people do.
Nicotine is an addiction. But
Yeah.
I think with alcohol specifically, you don't really
Unless
hear...
unless it's ruining your life, you know, actively, then
That's
people don't really think it's a problem.
That's right. That's right. Unless you're actively hitting the gutter and rock bottom.
Yeah.
You know, I made this maybe a little, you know, sharing a lot about my own internal world, but we have a family member through marriage who recently just went through a total destruction of his life because of alcohol. He started as just a casual alcohol drinker, and life started to pile on different stresses and responsibilities and difficulties in relationship to his family, to his job, things like that. Started drinking much more regularly, and ultimately that led to the loss of his marriage, moving out of the house where his children live and his now ex-wife lives. They filed for divorce, and I think he had 2 or 3 drunk driving accidents in addition to that, where he like wrecked his car. You know, his life really spiraled out and fell apart, and it was very sad for us to watch, because before that he was a very upright, responsible, you know, he really had a lot of structure and backbone to his life, but it really unraveled him. And it can happen like that very quickly, and we think it can't happen to us, but it does. It happens all the time. I promise every single person watching this video can think of at least one person that they know who started drinking heavily, and that led to a lot of problems in their life. You know,
Yeah.
and we've normalized that process, but
Yeah.
you know, I think it's healthy to talk about it and have an awareness of it, you know, because that's going to help prevent that from happening to you, right?
Yeah.
If you can be aware that, okay, this is a sneaky molecule. This is a very sneaky molecule, and it's addictive in a sneaky kind of way. And if you don't pay attention to it, it can unravel your life. Like, let's take Johnny Depp, for example, right? Who at one point, his net worth was $800 million. And he was buying, like, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like several $1 million worth of wine every single month.
What?
And he is now he is now either close to filing for bankruptcy or he has actually gone bankrupt.
That's crazy.
And that, in part, that's because, he had that court case with that woman. A lot of things started to happen as a result of that alcoholism and being afraid to call it out and call it for what it is.
Yeah.
Alcoholism, not just this isn't social drinking, this is a form of normalized alcoholism.
Yeah. If I could jump in on something you said previously, because a similar thought was coming up for me is, and now that I'm trying to backtrack into that thought, give me a second. I think you were saying earlier.
We're talking about Huberman and dopamine.
No, it wasn't that. It was it'll come to me. I'm not worried about it.
Well, I'll give you 1 second.
Okay.
So I did mention previously that Huberman gives this really terrific talk about the physiological nature of dopamine in the human body and why your brain produces dopamine and what it means to your body and to your mind. And what the biggest takeaway that I highly recommend watching this video. It's one of the most interesting videos I've ever seen with respect to motivation. And what he really gets into is that motivation is, we generally designate dopamine as a molecule that's used for reward, right? Like if you think about using cocaine, for example, it cranks your dopamine and it floods your body with dopamine. But in reality, what Huberman goes into and explains is that it's actually more closely related. And yeah, if you can pull up this podcast, Asaru, that'd be great. So it's actually more closely related to motivation. And that by going through this dopamine fixing, right, like masturbation and TV and eating ice cream and sweets and fast food and, all these things, doing cocaine and drinking caffeine and drinking alcohol, gambling, whatever it is, they all are forms of dopamine fixing, and they all ultimately reduce your ability to stay motivated. Because dopamine is actually a molecule that's more closely related to your motivation cycles and getting things done as a reward system than it is purely for reward.
Yeah.
So in other words, when you're providing the reward without giving the work, what you lose in that equation
is the desire for the work.
Is the desire for the work
Yeah.
that actually results in that
Which is
reward.
the whole,
So you
it
lose.
It exists to give you the reward after you do it, but now you're somehow just getting to the end.
Yeah, so you lose the motivation and the drive to get that reward. You stop associating driving and working hard towards something with the reward and start to associate just getting the reward by itself. And so you lose that motivation in that process.
I found my point I was looking for, and it's almost similar to that, which is basically like, if you look at addiction, a lot of it, and people say it all the time, it's pretty obvious, but it's like you're trying to escape from something you don't want to face, and that's where a lot of addiction comes from. Is like, instead of whenever something really difficult or painful or just something you have a lot of resistance to, instead of in that moment stopping, like admitting that that's reality, feeling everything involved with that, taking care of business, and like allowing whatever process needs to unfold in these uncomfortable situations in life as they come up, instead of doing that as like a little bit of a cushion or a little bit of reprieve or a break, or just trying to make it easier on yourself so you don't get too stressed out, we add in these things like alcohol or weed or whatever, even if it's just a stressful day or you had a breakup or you had this. It's like pretty common, you add in these little buffers, but then what happens is these buffers become like, now it's something you're relying upon to get you forward, instead of what you need is just to go face the situation. And so what, in every once in a while, small situations can be a nice little supplement, becomes a crutch, becomes like almost a fixed thing in your life that you need now because you've lost the will or the muscle to go fix that thing. So it's like, honestly, most people with addictions are just running from something difficult that happened a while ago, and now they don't even know why they're doing what they're doing anymore. It's just this like repeating cycle. But if you go deep within, you'll be like, oh, there's this thing I really don't want to feel. There's this thing I really don't want to talk about. There's this thing I really don't want to admit. But if you did that, then the need for relying on whatever substance or addictive habit you have is probably going to vanish pretty quickly. So, in my opinion.
You're bringing up such an important point, which is that really all addiction has a root in trauma of some kind. And you can define trauma in different ways, right? Trauma could be you broke up with your girlfriend. Trauma could be you had challenges in your upbringing. Trauma could be, any of a number of different things. And from that trauma, it's something we don't want to experience, number one. And our brains are extremely good at hiding trauma from us, right? Trauma could be you just weren't held enough as a baby. There's a spectrum of trauma, and it can range, from very mild to very severe. But ultimately that trauma gets hidden within our minds by our subconsciousness because our brain is so good at hiding things from us that it thinks is going to be harmful to us. And then from that, people start to look to addiction to offset those feelings, right? It's because it's easier to offset those feelings and to numb them than it is to actually confront them and face them and process them, because that involves actually, looking them head on and experiencing them and feeling them head on. And sometimes those feelings are very ugly. But if you look at all addiction has its roots in trauma. Dr. Gabor Mate, he's an expert in trauma and addiction, talks at great lengths about this subject, about the relationship between trauma and addiction. And he's one of the best authorities on that subject. If you want to look him up, is Dr. Gabor Mate. He's written a few books. He's got at least 1 or 2 documentary films out, and I know he's done a number of different interviews out there as well on this particular subject.
Word. I haven't heard of him, but
yeah, really interesting guy. He works a lot with opiate addicts.
Okay.
Like opiate addicts, and I think he's in Vancouver, British Columbia, if I'm not mistaken. I know he's done some work there, some patient work. Dr. Gabor Mate, Gabor Mate.
There's a book I've heard a few good friends.
That's the fella.
There's a book I've heard a few good friends talk about. I haven't read the book. It's
really sharp guy. Really, really sharp guy. Worth a listen.
He almost looks like the guy from Mission Impossible last night. The dude that gets his hand stabbed. A little bit. Anyways, I haven't read it, so I don't know anything about it. Your Body Keeps the Score.
Oh,
Have
sure.
you heard of that book?
I've heard of it.
It's something I want to read. I haven't read yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think it's about like trauma and generational trauma and stuff like that. Another point on it, on not only overcoming addiction, but preventing addiction that I've used in my life is I'll give this little I'll give the brief story of a brief story. There's this little parable people say. It's like, man walks down the street, falls into a deep hole. Eventually he climbs his way out. Day 2, man walks down the street, falls into the hole. Day 3, man walks down the street, goes to the left, the hole, walks around. And then it's like day 4, man takes a different street. And again, that's a really simplified version, but basically not only to overcome addiction, but just to prevent it. You have to take a different street in life, because if you get really close to the edge of something really tempting that you've already struggled with, you're probably gonna fall in. And wisdom is just learning when to take a different road a lot of times, so you don't cross that thing that's really gonna try to pull you into it. So a mindset I've always used since probably 18 is I never really drank in my life or never become addicted to substances. And I was like, all right, if at some point in my life, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I'm going to have to look at this action I'm constantly taking, this habit, and be like, look, I need to get rid of this because it's destructive. Why ever go down the road in the first place? If I know at some point I'm going to have to quit this because it's really not good for me, why start? So to me, it's don't start something you're not going to want to finish. And if at some point you know that you need to leave it, whether that's a relationship that has some sort of pleasure but really doesn't give you anything fulfilling in the end, or a substance like alcohol, like to me, if you know that the long-term outcome is bad, just take a different road and just don't start the path. Because now you're gonna have to go down this long cycle of fighting it, up and down, all this stuff, and eventually leave it anyways, because most of these things lead into deterioration or death. So it's like, just choose something else that isn't gonna do that for you, so you don't even have to fight the battle. So if you can win the small battle up front to avoid things, you don't have to fight these super long battles in the first place. So prevention, is of vital importance if you're not already addicted to something. It's a different topic once you're addicted. It's a whole different path you gotta take. But you can do a lot of good by just never having to fight the battle in the first place. In my mind.
Yeah, you're bringing up a really good point, which like for me, I'd say my weak spot is like complacency, right? Where I'll just become sort of complacent in my discipline. I could use like cannabis as a great example where like I'll sometimes just use cannabis in just a compulsory way just because I'm just accustomed to doing that. Because for me, that's been my longest addiction through my entire life. And I've gone through periods where I don't use it, and I've gone through periods where I do use it. But I can find myself easily slip into periods where I just compulsively do it. Just out of habit, you know what I mean? There's not any real reason why I need to do it. It's just my comfort zone, right? Yeah. Like for some guys, it's going home at the end of the day of work, sitting on the couch and cracking open a beer. And for me, it's always just been like smoking a bowl, lighting a joint, and that just puts me in kind of my comfortable, relaxed, sort of complacent sort of space. But there's a real danger there. And I think in just becoming sort of weak with your discipline, right? It just happens to be there. It just happens to be in arm's reach. So you use it because it's just there, So I think for me, that's one of the harder parts is like after I've already quit something, right? When it's in that arm's reach, or somebody's next to you and they offer it to you, having the discipline to just be like, no, I'm going to stick with where I am, right? Because I know that could be a slippery slope and that could bring me back down to old habits and old ways of doing things. So I think you're bringing up a very good point there. That like, you gotta have the discipline, right? You need to have the discipline in order to make good choices.
Yeah, 100%. I would want to talk about one of two things. One, potentially diving into your recent little triumph of nicotine, like either your little story, like what prompted you to just make a new decision, and maybe tying into that or leading off of that, I would, at some point would also love to talk about what is the difference between addiction and habits, and how can we move from addiction to habits?
That's a really great question. Yeah. So, generally in previous times in my life when I've used nicotine, it was to help to balance my stress load, mostly stress, right? Where I would go through a stressful situation or circumstance, and I would use it as a tool to do some of that heavy lifting. And nicotine is very useful to do that, but there's also a lot of very negative qualities to nicotine. Like it hardens your artery walls, it increases your blood pressure, it causes extra stress on your heart, it can cause heart arrhythmia, but it can also help with your focus and your thinking. And as mentioned, increase your dopamine and lower your stress. And so I was using it a lot in that way. And, to speak with respect to like my present circumstances, I really started using nicotine much more heavily in recent years, not in recent years, but in recent weeks really, after a major breakup with a girlfriend. And I had moved across the country, 3,000 miles, and I had gone through a breakup, and I felt like my world was just kind of like changing a lot around me, and it was difficult to keep up with everything that was happening. So I started to leverage using nicotine more because I needed to maintain my center, right? I needed to maintain my centeredness and make sure that the things that I needed to do and the responsibilities that I needed to stay on top of were still there and structured. And I felt like the easiest way to do that was by utilizing nicotine. But it's not sustainable. It isn't something that you can sustain and keep doing. And I started to remember, a long time ago, the previous time that I quit nicotine, I had gone to the dentist and they had checked my blood pressure, and my blood pressure was like sky high, sky high. And I started thinking, I was like, I'm only 38, 39 years old. I am way too young to have my blood pressure be this high. And I quit right then and there. Like, that was the previous time that I quit. And I didn't want to have my health negatively impacted. And for me, it was just this internal argument of like, no, this is really stupid. Like, you're really going to impact your future if you keep doing this when you really don't need to be doing this. And so I kind of, in my most recent, quitting, a few things that I'd like to say. First is that the way I approached it is I found a period of time where I could lower my stress and my stress triggers enough that I could get off of a moving train. Quitting nicotine is hard, and anyone who tells you differently is not telling you the truth. The most success I've heard people have with nicotine is actually through hypnotherapy. I've heard that people have been extremely successful using hypnosis in order to get off of nicotine. I personally just quit cold turkey, but the times that I have quit nicotine, I've always done it through weaning off and lowering the concentration of the nicotine that I'm using over time. So that means basically setting like a diet for a week. You say, okay, I'm gonna do, I'm only gonna hit my vaporizer 10 times today, and then 8 tomorrow, and then 6 the day after that, and so on, until I get that concentration of nicotine down as far as I can get it to where I feel like, okay, now the train isn't moving so fast and I can step off without kind of crashing and hurting myself. Because the truth is, you need to forecast quitting nicotine. It's not something that you should take lightly. People have destroyed marriages quitting nicotine. People have destroyed business relationships and jobs quitting nicotine. And if you think that that's not true, I can tell you matter of factly it is true, that people have very real world consequences when they try to get off that addiction. So it is something that you should try to forecast and you should try to pay attention to. And really for me, it's just sheer willpower, but the willpower comes from lowering that barrier by weaning it down as much as you can before you decide to actually step off. And then I do a number of different techniques in order to try to mitigate the risk of using again. One of those techniques is I hide it from myself. I put it in a place in my room where I wouldn't normally put it, or in my house, right? If I have a normal stash spot where I normally keep the nicotine, I put it somewhere else. I put it in a drawer, and I'll move it day by day. I'll move it to a different place in my, in the bathroom or in the closet or in a drawer, so that my brain doesn't have this like go-to spot. It's not like the milk in the refrigerator. I just go get it when it's ready, right? There's an additional thought, an additional step to where it is, locating it and using it. Another technique that I've used with great success is I'll go through the motions like I'm doing it, but I won't actually do it. So for example, if you're a cigarette smoker, you'll pull out the cigarette, you'll put it in your mouth as though you're gonna light it, but you don't actually do it. You just bring it to your mouth and then you put it back in the pack and you go about your business. And it almost tricks the brain into thinking you did it, even though you didn't. And so I found that is actually also extremely helpful with quitting. But yeah, I think the hardest part with the nicotine is days, say 3 to 6, is when physically you're gonna go through the most withdrawal. You're gonna go through, like I went through sweats, I went through chills, I went through feeling extremely disturbed and irritable and very easily irritated. And you can do some displacement there.
You hit it pretty well. It wasn't terrible to be around.
Yeah, I was metered with it. I was very metered with it. And there's another technique that's really, really helpful if you are quitting nicotine. If you're quitting anything really. And there's actually a term for this. I can't think of it off the top of my head. But if you switch the mode of action for how you get a particular molecule, that is going to increase your odds of actually quitting it. So for example, if you're somebody that uses chews or gum and you switch to using a snuff, or if you're somebody that smokes, switch to a vape. If you're somebody that vapes, switch to a gum. So by switching the mode of action in that weaning period, you're going to increase your odds of actually quitting successfully. So yeah, I think I'm probably now 2 to 3 weeks off of my nicotine habit, and usually by like days 8 or 9, the actual physical craving of it diminishes significantly. And from there, it's a lot easier to hold the line. At that point, you're not going to have a physical desire to actually do it. And all you have to do is just make good decisions at that point by not doing more of it.
Nice.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
But yeah, I plan to stay off basically indefinitely, with the exception of like very rare occasions where, it might be used in like a medicine circle, for example.
Yeah.
That might be an occasion where I use it.
It's just not the daily, just let's do it because we can.
Yeah, I think it's become so normalized, like nicotine vaping in particular,
Yeah.
I think has become so extremely normalized. And what I'm finding is that like a lot of young people in their, teens, 20s, 30s, I even see guys in their 40s out using vapes,
Yeah.
I look over in the car next to me and there's some guy that's 40 years old, 45 years old, and he's just chewing away at that vape. And it produces formaldehyde when you combust it. The nicotine is often synthetic and synthesized in China. You can look on the box, it says synthetic nicotine. It's not even derived from a plant. It's made in a laboratory somewhere. There's not a lot of regulation with respect to the compounds that they're putting in there for flavor, for taste, for the terpenes. They're putting artificial flavors in, like the way you'd use artificial flavors in candies and gums, things like that. And you're burning those and combusting them. And those are creating unwanted, dangerous byproducts. It's not widely regulated, and there's a lot of impurity in these things. And, outside of the habit itself of having this compulsion you have to have, it's not very good for you at all. And there are a lot of things scientifically I think we don't know about vape devices in general.
Yeah, 100%.
So I think it's, I think what you're going to see, and I don't want to predict this and say that it's forecasting what's going to happen, but I think the odds are good that a lot of people who've continued to use these vape devices through their 20s, when they get to their middle to upper 30s, they're probably going to have a lot of cardiovascular problems. And they're going to start to have their doctor report to them that they have a lot of cardiovascular problems, whether that's high blood pressure or an irregular heartbeat or any of a number of flavors of cardiovascular problems that can emerge from the use of vaporizers and e-cigarettes. There is already a lot of data, at least acute use, of how that impacts your blood pressure. And what they've found in studies is that young smokers who use vape devices in their early 20s have the same cardiovascular expression as cigarette smokers who have used cigarettes for almost 20 years. And the reason that's alarming is both that the people using them are younger and have been using them for less time. But we're seeing that they actually have the same impact
That's crazy.
on their cardiovascular health and blood pressure as these cigarette smokers who have used them for years and years and years and years and years. I don't want to necessarily recommend that you should smoke cigarettes as opposed to using vaporizing devices. If you're a nicotine user, that's a decision you're going to have to make for yourself. But if it was me personally, I would rather use a cigarette than I would a vape device, simply because you can't get as much nicotine in your body. And there's just so many things about vaporizer devices that we don't know. Whereas the dangers of cigarettes are pretty well known, pretty well documented, and pretty well studied. So it's a little more.
And to me, it's like
the devil you know is better than the one you don't.
To me, it's like I think I hit a vape for the first time like 3 weeks ago. I was going to karaoke and someone had it, and I was like, screw it. It's not something I'd like or care about or enjoy, so I'm just not gonna do it.
Ooh, puppy.
Anyways. To me, whenever you're holding a device like that, it's hard to really see the potential harm in it because it's just like it's almost more abstract. But when you're holding like a cigarette, or something like that, it's a little bit more in your face of what you're doing. I think so. I think there's almost there's a point of separation that diminishes in people's minds what's really going on because it's just like I'm holding this cool looking little thing. You don't really see it happening. I could be wrong, but that's just if you're smoking a cigarette, you really know what you're doing. and people, it's been out there for a while.
You know what you're doing.
You know what you're doing. You're smoking a vape. It feels like, how could this be bad? That's just my perspective.
Let's take it out wider too, right? Like the powers that be, right? Like the Matrix, whatever you want to call it, the people who make the decisions, the echelons of power, they want you to be addicted. They want you to have addictions. There's a reason that the most addictive legal drugs are available on every street corner in America. Okay? And it's because these are drugs that make you work longer, harder. You become more complacent with your conditions, Yeah,
that's so true. It's not just tobacco, but on a big scale, I couldn't agree more that, like, whatever that is, the powers that be, they want they want you needing something outside of yourself as much as possible in any form of consumerism or addiction for two reasons. One, you're so focused on getting that's going to take up your time, your effort, your money, your energy. It's also going to bring you consequences you're going to have to deal with. Two, it's removing all your desire for more freedom, for more like expression, it decreases your drive, your reward systems for the things in life that actually matter. And so you care less and less and less about all the BS that's coming at you. And you just kind of become this zombie that's just looking for the next hit. And you're going to be complicit to anything that happens, have no like firm resolve within yourself to say no or even care about it at all. So you're just off chasing your high, you're off chasing your addiction. Whenever these big problems come up and you need to have the force of will and the courage and the strength and all that to stand up to something, you've got none of that available in your arsenal because it's kind of been stripped from you. So of course they're going to encourage that. They're going to encourage you to need something outside yourself and to also be so distracted and zombified that, you have no backbone.
Absolutely. That's what the powers that be want. They want consumers that are complacent and just show up and pick up their item day by day, week by week, steady drip, fast food, nicotine, sugar, whatever it happens to be. And that's what they want. They want you to be dumbed down. They want you to be complacent. And so quitting addictions is one of the strongest ways that you can leverage yourself against the grain when it comes to society trying to keep you suppressed, trying to keep you dumb, trying to keep you fat, trying to keep you slow, physically, mentally, emotionally. Lack critical
They don't
thinking.
even have to control you because you're literally controlling
yourself
but not in a good
using
way.
the things that they provide. And like you're
making the job so much easier.
It's gotten to like, I can't think of the word. It's become like an epidemic basically. Like you drive around the city, any city you're in, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of nicotine and smoke shops. You go to every gas station, there's an entire wall of vaporizers in every gas station you go to in America now. It's insane. It's absolutely insane.
There's no way they're going to be there.
It's basically the main product now.
There's no way it's going to be there if there's not a demand for it.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. You need to be tactful when you're quitting. Like you need to. It's very helpful to pick a window of time, and dedicate that window of time to quitting. Because if you try to juggle it with your job, with extremely stressful conditions, chances are you're not going to succeed. And your withdrawal symptoms are going to bleed out into your normal, healthy life. And that can be, harmful and have unwanted consequences, for sure.
100%. Well, if I feel like wrapping it up soon, but I think a goal of ours here is to leave on positive notes. So I think one more quick topic is let's look at the potential almost positive side of addiction, which, like I said, is more of like habit, because most things that are good for you are going to be things that you're choosing to do, not compulsively doing. But I heard a great thing from a guy. He wrote this book called How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. His name's Scott Adams. He wrote the Dilbert comic strip for 30 years or something. But what he said yesterday, he's like the secret to success and health, fitness, whatever, He's like, I'll give it to you. It's just doing it daily. So it doesn't quite matter what you're doing in a positive note. What matters the most is that you're doing it consistently. So the other side of addiction is like commitment and consistency in positive habits. And they may not be addiction, but it's something you're doing daily. And to kind of flip it from like what you shouldn't be doing daily, here's what you should be doing daily. Find something that's going to make you better, that's got an easy enough like window to walk through. That's basically like something you can definitely do every day, and just do it. It doesn't hardly even matter what it is, whether you're walking, whether you're swimming, whether you're hiking, whether you're just eating decently like good food for you, drinking water. Find literally anything that you can go do every day and start there, and almost become addicted to that process of adding in more and more things that are good for you. You can jump off that topic anyway you want.
But that's a really great point. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's something I wanted to mention, is that like it's really important if you take an addiction out of your life to replace it.
Yes.
It's very helpful to replace one bad habit with a good one.
Yeah.
So if you're quitting, marijuana or alcohol or nicotine or food, replace it with exercise. Replace it with going for walks. Replace it with a new hobby, right?
Yeah.
Displace that hole that you're creating by taking one form of support out and replace it with something that's a more healthy form of support for you. And then committing to that, being disciplined and structured and committing to that and showing up for that. And like that in my opinion is one of the best ways to pave the road forward, so that you're getting out of something that maybe is negative and isn't serving you, and moving into something positive that is going to serve you and provide for you and enrich your life in a positive way.
100%. Yeah. To me, if you look at your life, like say your life is like a house you found from the 1980s. So you find this house, you're given this house, and it's got some bad things in the foundation, but it's also got some good qualities. How are you gonna make anything as a structure better? You're gonna remove the bad things and you're gonna add in good things. So as each time you're removing a bad thing, you want to replace it, upgrade it with something else. And to me, that's one way to look at your whole life, is like if you're constantly removing the bad, adding the good, your entire life is going to be better continually as a process. And to me, it's just an easy way to think about it, is like if I'm constantly upgrading the small little pieces of my life is always going to become funner, more healthy, more beautiful, more enriching, and stronger. So, yeah.
And I think absolutely. And I think it's also important to be soft about the process. Like, don't judge yourself too harshly. Like, if you try to quit and you have like kind of a little relapse and you go back into some old habits for a little while, that's okay. Like, it doesn't serve you to beat yourself up if you don't succeed, right? Like, if I'm trying to quit eating sugary food and one night I eat a bunch of ice cream, it doesn't serve me to beat myself up about it.
Yeah.
So you want to come to this from a perspective of friendliness and kindness and non-judgmentalness. You know the direction you're trying to go, but if you don't hit it exactly your first time, or you have a moment of weakness, that's okay. That's normal. That's human. It happens to everyone. And the softer you can be about that, the more successful you will likely be in actually quitting, because you won't feel like such a failure because you just had this moment of weakness, which is totally normal, totally human, and happens to everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're not going to stress yourself out so much. Feel like, you know what? Have a little compassion. I'm trying. I'm getting better.
I'm showing improvement.
Yeah.
I'm moving in the right direction.
If you're over time trending upwards versus trending downwards, then that's a success. So,
have you ever heard of the 1%? I don't know exactly what it's called, but it's called like the 1% philosophy, which is basically like try to get just 1% better every single day.
Oh yeah.
Right? Just 1%. It's just 1/100th of the fraction. Don't try to revolutionize the way you approach things overnight. Just, if you can just get progress, like Tony Robbins says, progress equals happiness. That's like his phrase, right? just every single day, try to get just a little progress towards the direction that you're trying to go. It doesn't mean that you have to do it overnight. It just means that if you're making progress, you're moving in the right direction, then you're winning.
100%. All right. Thanks for tuning in. Take the high road. Peace out.